Okay, hang on a sec. Right. Okay. So thank you very much, Helen. And I guess the first thing I should say is to thank the BACC for the opportunity to actually talk tonight. I'd just like to start very briefly with a little bit of the presentation housekeeping. I've got Jenny Craig with me. Jenny's doing the third talk, the one on the immune response, which will be very interesting. But Jenny's going to basically monitor the chat with any questions, with the idea that basically she'll sort of screen questions, and at the end of the talk, which I'm hoping will be about an hour long, then we can spend some time answering the questions as best we can. So there's a couple of things I want to apologize in advance for. The first thing is that probably we'll have some technical problems because I'm not very good at clicking things on computers. So apologies in advance for that. Second thing I want to apologize in advance for is any really appalling pronunciation of Chinese, because I really have no idea how Chinese is pronounced. So I'll give it my best shot, and I hope I don't offend anybody or swear in Chinese or anything in the process. So, and what I want to try and do tonight is I want to explore the origins of both Moxa and acupuncture. In doing so, I want to challenge some myths, and hopefully I'm going to float a myth of my own at the end. But all along, hopefully, what I also want to do is identify the key part that Moxa has played in the evolution of acupuncture, particularly its origins and also its potential as a treatment. So on that note, I want to talk a little bit about origins. So particularly origin myths. Now every culture pretty much on earth, probably every human culture, has an origin myth, and if we talk about acupuncture or acumoxa as a culture, we could also say that it has its own origin myths. Obviously the word myths is in there, so it's difficult to know how much we can take seriously and how much we can't, but I want to discuss some of them tonight. For instance, the origin myths in the Mediterranean basin with the what do you call it, the Abrahamic religions is Adam and Eve. In Korea, interesting origin myth. It involves mugwort. Mugwort gets in there, so so I'm quite fond of that one. Australians, the Aborigines, they have this wonderful idea of dream time as being in part of their origin myth. But the picture on the right of the screen here is a depiction of the origin myth of the Japanese culture, the original Japanese culture, and basically it describes how the gods, particularly this one god, he got a spear and he stuck it in the ocean, stirred up the ocean, and out of the ocean then emerged the archipelago of Japan. Lovely little story. Beautiful picture, I've got to say, but also it resonates for me because I'm going to stick a spear in the origin myths of acumoxa, and so I hope I'm not going to cause too much offense in doing so, because I appreciate the challenging origin myths is a risky business. But actually, in my defense, I'm also going to add that as far as I'm aware, China has a mixture of origin myths, and they conflict with each other. There's obviously the origin myth of the Tao, yin yang, heaven and earth. There's also an origin myth around the new year, which, as I understand it, I may well have this wrong, but the first new year, animals were created over the next, I think, 15 days of the new year. Hence the way we have the Chinese New Year passed down to us. So yeah, and there's another one, Pangu. Pangu is some supreme being who's at the. So what I'm basically saying is, just like with Chinese medicine, there's conflicting ideas. So I hope you'll forgive me if I throw a new conflicting idea into the mix on them. So it's customary, I think, in these talks to give a little bit of information about the speaker. So I thought I'd just do this very briefly. And the bit I want to really focus on is what brought me to Moxa, and hopefully this bit here, the Moxa Africa charity, which we founded, Jenny and I both founded, 14 years ago, I think it is now, to investigate whether Moxa might be helpful for treatment for tuberculosis. And basically, really, the sort of deep dive in acupuncture that I've been involved in since then has been because if you're going to speak to people, particularly in the biomedical world, about Moxa, it's a pretty good idea to know a little bit about what you're talking about. And both this talk and the third talk, as I mentioned, kind of like epitomizes really that we've earned a little bit of credibility, I think, over the years. In the bottom right hand corner, I hope I don't offend anybody, but it's a little cutting from a beautiful painting, extraordinary painting by Caravaggio of Thomas, the disciple, who plainly didn't believe anything that Jesus was telling him at the time. So basically Jesus said, look, if you don't believe me, stick your finger in your wound. And in a sense, I understand Thomas. If I was a disciple, I'd definitely be Thomas, because I think sometimes we do need to stick our fingers in and see what really is going on to convince ourselves of what we're talking about. One other thing, which is my personal bias in terms of Moxa, as everybody who's listening to this will know, there's lots and lots of different ways of applying Moxa. The one that we're particularly focused on, both Jenny and myself, is small cone direct Moxa, rice grain Moxa, whatever you want to call it, just smolders down to the skin, and it can be very powerful. Again, there'll be a little bit more evidence of that from Jenny, I think, in about a month's time. So now we start really getting to the nub of the talk itself. So where and when did acupuncture start? Well, now I think it's fairly well agreed it started in China. I don't think there's much debate about it. Well, I do remember reading something years ago that there was a theory that it started in India and traveled to China, and the Chinese took it on and it died out in India. I have no idea how true that is. But if you just bear with me a sec, I want it to it's wonderful, isn't it? It doesn't do, yeah, it does. I've got it. So it's this bit. I don't know if that highlights. So it's this bit that I want to talk about. If I do a little internet search on the origins of acupuncture, I'm going to find any one of these 4 dates, certainly ranging between 9,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago. So, you know, it can't be all of them. And so I want to home in on what it really might be from a more scholarly perspective. So if you go for the earliest interpretation of when acupuncture started, you'll come across this idea of these Bian stones, sharpened stones dating from maybe 6,000 BC, maybe earlier if that 9,000 is to be given credit, and a piece of stone used for treating illness by pricking the body. Now that's actually a translation from this Shuowen Jieji, the earliest or one of the earliest Chinese dictionaries from around 100 AD or CE. Now this is interesting because Han Fei, who's the author, was basically explaining these ideogram or ideographs, I think we call them, of pictograms, don't we? Pictograms, which were in the earlier surviving texts at the time, and it was a kind of like etymological investigation. And he picked up the fact that that these bian stones were used for treating illness by pricking the body. So we can take that on face value. It's not difficult to, when you start to think about it, the bian stones really could not have been used for acupuncture as we know it, particularly, and I think this is important, in terms of regulating qi. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. But basically, they are clumsy instruments, and they would be using probably for piercing boils. Who knows? But it really is hard. It's really hard to imagine that they were anything but a primitive and very primitive precursor for acupuncture. So the question comes back: when did acupuncture really start? So the clue, I think, is when this word first came into the Chinese language, Zhenzhou. And it's a compound word. And the interesting thing is, and this is the word for acupuncture in Chinese, it incorporates acupuncture and moxa. So if you break it down into the two parts, on the left-hand side here, you've got the metal needle, and on the right-hand side, you've got the moxa. So this word, this compound word, Zhenzhou, didn't come through into Western languages, which I think has maybe fed the what I consider to be a bit of a bias against moxa in the West. I thought I'd just share with you where I think this regional dichotomy came from in the West, and from a historical perspective. So you've got you've got to blame French for everything, haven't you? So in this case, yes, again, it's the French. Father Placide Javier, who was a Jesuit missionary and was in China, and he published this book in 1671, and introduced coined the word acupuncture. It's the first time it appeared in Western languages. Didn't mention moxa. This is the book itself, Les Secrets de la Médecine des Chinois. My pronunciation of French is possibly a little bit better than my Chinese, but maybe not too much. But there's a second, which is a better known, I think, source of early acupuncture in Europe, which is Dutch, from Willem ten Rijn, from 1683. Now, the Dutch were in East Asia because of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, and so he was a doctor who were MD. It's interesting on that, and this text down here, he was actually, they used the word MD in the 17th century. I hadn't noticed that before. He also mentioned moxa, funny enough. Now, the centre of operations for the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, was Batavia, which is now Jakarta in Indonesia. But Ten Rijn mentioned moxa, but he mentioned moxa for a reason, and that's because it had already been introduced into Europe from another Dutchman, also involved with the VOC, also in Batavia, and he actually coined the word moxibustion. It's a great story. I won't go into too much detail, but he had the Dutch were terrible drinkers, and he had a terrible case of gout. And his wife, he was a reverend. His wife was had she's from Vietnam, I think, but a doctress, an Oriental doctress, who practiced moxa and persuaded her husband to have moxa on his foot, and he was miraculously cured. So my angle on it is that the Reverend Bischoff realized that he could be onto something here. There's a lot of gout back in Europe. So basically he sent a load back, sent a text back, sent a load of the moxa back to his brother and his brother and his son in Utrecht, and with an idea that they were going to make quite a pile of money out of it, I suspect. This picture down in the bottom right-hand corner is an illustration from the English version. It was sold in London. A new way of curing the gout. So ever since then, there's been this division between the two in Europe. So just want to come back to these Zhenzhou, the ideogram for Moxa, and I particularly want to, just bear with me, I want to focus on this part of the Zhou part. So if you probably, a lot of you will have recognized, we've got the fire radical on the left for the, the metal radical for the needle. We've got the fire radical for the Moxa, and above here is pretty straightforward. The needle is like a dagger shape. But the Moxa, there's this strange character over the top. This is Zhou. So I just want to talk about that for a minute. Hopefully, yep, here we go. So here's the character Zhou. Now this character, intriguing, it's actually very old. It was, and this is thanks to that same guy, Zhang Fei, who wrote that dictionary. He described it as being used for in association with oracle bone divination. Oracle bone divination was involved right back to the Shang dynasty. So we're going back to possibly as long ago as 1000 BCE. And basically they used the shells of tortoises, or they used the scapula of oxen, wrote on them, and then they drilled holes in them, in whatever they were using. They drilled holes in it, and then they put very hot material, probably metal rods. There is a theory that mugwort was used, but I don't know how genuine that whether it's a little bit fanciful. But basically that would split the oracle bone, and then the shaman would interpret the forecast for the emperor or whatever. Loads and loads of these have been found. So what that indicates is that Moxa could be very old. And if it is 1000 BC, there's absolutely no question in my mind that it's older than acupuncture. It probably isn't 1000 BC, but we've got to go looking for it. So we've got two places to look. One's in the literature and the other is in the archaeology, and actually they overlap. So earliest literary sources that I found anyway, the earliest one is from the Book of Odes, which is Ode 72. It's from around about 700 BCE, and there he is gathering the mugwort. A day without seeing him is like 3 years. This is a very unclear picture on the right-hand corner. I apologize for its best thing I could find. This 3 years is a very interesting thing, because 3 years is something that comes back again and again. I'll talk about a little bit more about it later. But plainly from this, there was something significant about mugwort around about 700 BCE. We can't say much more about that, obviously. A little bit more now about the 3 years thing. It survives today because tradition is that refined mugwort should be 3 years before you use it. Whether that's 3 years, there's a difference of opinion as far as I've established between whether you store it for 3 years before you refine it, or whether you refine it and then store it for 3 years before you use it, if you see what I mean. And I think there's a difference between China and Japan on that, but I'm not 100% clear, so I won't say any more about it. To another early example, this includes the 3 years. This is from Mengzhe. Mengzhe was a Confucian. Mencius, that's the sort of Latinized name for him. The case of a prince who might want to be king today is like someone with a 7-year-old illness needing 3-year-old mugwort to cure it. Now, I've got to say, I've thought about this quite a lot, and I still can't figure out exactly what it means. But I think what it means is the prince just shouldn't assume he's going to be king, or a good king, just because he's a prince. But this also implies, I don't know whether that's right or wrong, but it also implies to me that Moxa was already being thought about for being helpful with chronic illness, 7-year-old illness. That's got to be a chronic illness, hasn't it? Now this one's from a little bit more recent than 700 BC. We're talking about 379, 272. So somewhere. He lived a long time, didn't he? I've just noticed that he lived over 100 years, according to that. So somewhere about 200, 250 BC. Well, no, what if we're talking about 300, 350 BC, something like that. This one I love. This one is he's a Taoist philosopher. Again, from the similar time. My case has been like that of a man who burnt Moxa on himself without being ill. Now, I think what that means, it's not important, but I think what that means is a bit of a stupid. He's calling himself a little bit stupid, because I think that there may have been an idiom in Chinese, which was, you're like somebody who burns Moxa on yourself and you're not even ill. What do you want to do that for? So, but the point I'm making is there's 3 very significant instances of the literature in which mugwort and Moxa is being identified. We can't draw too much in terms of conclusion from them, but there appears to be something significant. So, yeah, the book of Books is from the spring and autumn period, 770 to 475. The 2 philosophers are from the Warring States period. Is a very unstable time in China, but it was also a time when philosophers were burgeoning. There's the Taoists, the legalists, the Confucians, the Mohists. So this is a really important time for Chinese philosophy. But the earliest evidence of acupuncture in the literature is from a lot later. Well, a bit later anyway. The earliest evidence, this is of the systematic use of acupuncture, and we've got to be clear about this. This is as part of a systematic medicine, and it dates really from around 100 BCE. And you've got the 3 seminal texts, which is the Neijing Suwen, the Neijing Ling Shu, and at least I'm just deferring to scholarship here, the Nanjing, which is a little bit later. They are probably, almost certainly, two distinct schools of medicine. We tend to sort of collate them and cherry pick as we want these days, but plainly these are older. Younger than these references to Moxa. Trying to wrap this up, I'd also say that it's pretty much technically impossible that acupuncture, anything resembling acupuncture as we know today, was possible prior to something around that time, about 100 BCE, because you've probably all heard of the so-called 9 needles, which are mentioned in both the Suwen and the Ling Shu. And the 9 needles included the haozhen. The haozhen is the hair needle, which is what we would recognize an acupuncture needle today. It's impossible to make hair needles out of what needles could have been made of in the time that we're talking about from those quotes. They'd be made from gold, silver, bronze, or tin. It would be an incredibly difficult job. The photo at the top there on the right-hand side is of the earliest needles that have survived. I think they reckon they were entombed in about 117 BCE, I think, something like that. But they're made of gold and silver, and you can see they're fairly substantial. The diameter of the needle part is probably 2 or 3 millimeters, so they're not acupuncture as we know it. But the other important thing, very important thing, I think, to note is that haozhen, when they were made, when they could be made from steel, would have been very precious and very expensive. In other words, they wouldn't have been available to anybody without means, and they would have been in very limited supply. But just to sort of kind of give myself a bit of credibility in it, I want to invoke probably certainly the best Western scholar on Chinese medicine, Paul Unschuld, and 2 quotes he talked about in reference to Suwen, in reference of Moxa. In his writings, he describes Moxa as cauterization, because he's a scholar, and he says basically straight, cauterization played only an insignificant role in Suwen. I think that's unarguable if you look at it. Suen actually is, by some people believe, is more about bleeding actually than about what we describe as acupuncture. I'm not too sure about how true that is, but and the second thing is, you said the techniques of cauterization are not mentioned. I've added at all in the Suen. The techniques we're talking about, not cauterization itself, but the techniques, suggesting that this was already common knowledge and didn't require written instruction. I think that's something to think about. I'm personally not sure if I completely agree with it. I think there may be something else going on, which I'll come to in a little bit. So then if we want to go, we want to then look at the archaeological evidence. And the archaeological evidence is, actually we've seen those needles already, but the archaeological evidence is actually more literate evidence. So the key evidence comes from the Mound-Way tombs, which were uncovered or dug starting in 1973. And in one of the tombs is a prince's tomb, and they know when it was closed. It was closed in 168 BC. In other words, that's before the earliest date for either of the Nanjing texts, and certainly for the Nanjing text. And that tomb contained 14 medical scrolls, which is interesting because not one of them included a single reference. Now, I think that's important to consider. There are two explanations for that. Of course, one is, could be perfectly reasonable, that the prince didn't like acupuncture. He knew about it, but didn't like acupuncture. And the second is that maybe acupuncture just wasn't in the, it wasn't commonly used and wasn't part of medical practice at the time that he died. 14 scrolls, 4 of them were, it's not working, yeah. 4 of them referred Moxa. And of those 4, entirely devoted to Moxa. So they were literally Moxa scrolls. The interesting thing is that they provide a seminal presentation of channel theory, what we would now call Jingle theory, but they were actually, they actually described them as Mai, which is a vessel. That's how it's translated today. Is that what it meant? Is that what it meant in 168 or 200 BC or earlier, when these texts may have been written? I have no idea. I don't think any of us do. But the very, very interesting thing is that one of these scrolls really formed an accurate template for Ling Shu 10, which was the chapter which was the first description of the channels, the circulation of qi in the channels in the Acu classics. It's an immensely important chapter, and it's pretty much stayed in acupuncture theory. It's pretty much remained the same ever since, describing the channels. The lung goes into the, I'm not going to say because I'm bound to get it wrong, but and so the Ling Shu is also known as the Zhenjing, or the needle classic. So it tells you that the Ling Shu particularly is maybe more focused on acupuncture itself, and how this chapter actually is what you can say from our perspective, from our mythology, is the real the Bible almost. So we've got these 2 Moxa. They have no titles, but they've been given titles by scholars today. So we've got 2, just very briefly. One is the 11-foot arm vessels Moxa Classic, and the other is the 11 yin-yang vessels Moxa Classic. From my perspective, the interesting thing is that one is simpler than the other, or less developed, or less involved. So the 11-foot arm is less involved. The 11 yin-yang is more involved. They're not coherent with each other. What's new? Because lots of chapters in the Ling Shu and the Suen aren't coherent with each other either. So we should get used to that if we study Chinese medicine for any time. I want to compare 3 texts, the 2 Moxa texts and Ling Shu 10, because this is where I think it gets quite interesting. So we've got the 11-foot arm vessel, which is the less developed, the 11 yin-yang vessel, which is the more developed, and then Ling Shu. So first of all, the dates, the best estimates, we know that these are because of the the Chinese ideograms, we know that this is pre-Han Dynasty. So it's pre-202 BCE. It could be any time before then, in the previous 100, 200 years probably. So it gives an idea that these are both earlier than Lingshu, which is probably between 104 and 32 BCE. So we know that these two are older. The meridians or vessels, they're vessels in the Moxa classics, and meridians we could call them in the Lingshu. There's 11 in the Moxa, both Moxa classics, and there's 12, of course, as we know it. The one that's missing is a pericardial meridian, interestingly, and the direction of channels gets very interesting because these two in the Moxa classics, they're not coherent with each other. One of them comes in, so all the meridians, the directions from the end of the limbs into the body. With the 11 Yin Yang classics, we've got mainly from the end of the limbs, but there's a couple of exceptions. And in the Lingshu, we've got this fully interconnected circuit, which is the key to regulating qi with acupuncture. The number of indications for use of Moxa or acupuncture in these three texts, we've got 78 in the foot arm, we've got 147, so nearly double in the Yin Yang, and we've got 217 in the Lingshu chapter 10. So you can see it's moving towards where we've got to in Lingshu. And the observations that we've got it's more basic, it's more sophisticated, and we've got 2 groups of indications for each meridian in the Lingshu, which is very similar to what we've got in the Yin Yang vessel. But the style, this is interesting, the style appears to be directly copied from the Yin Yang classic, the Yin Yang Moxa classic. And then the treatment method, Moxa only, and then finally acupuncture only in the Lingshu. Direction channel is interesting as well. We've got variable directions in all of them. There are 11 references to variable channel directions in the Suen, the Lingshu, and the Nanjing. Only 3 of them are coherent with the Qi model in Lingshu 10. Interestingly, 3, same amount in the Lingshu 1, Lingshu 17, and Nanjing 23 are consistent with the 11-foot arm vessels of the Moxa classic. So there does appear to be quite a lot of confusion at this point in time. I've got to keep moving because I'm going to run out of time otherwise. An idea about where we've got kind of what we can cheaply call copy and pasting. So this is we're comparing 2 in this one. This is the Yin Yang classic, and this is the Lingshu. It's called the ear vessel, misspelled. In the Moxa classic, it's the Sanjiao meridian of the Han Shao Yang. In the Lingshu, the ear vessel was the triple burner channel, and the mouth meridian was the large intestine channel, interestingly, in the Moxa classic. And so basically it's the text, and I just want to focus. If the meridian is diseased, there'll be deafness, thunderous ringing of the ears, swelling pain in the throat. And then in the Lingshu, if the meridian is diseased, there will be deafness, thunderous ringing of the ears, and swelling and pain of the throat. Kind of familiar with each other. Indication 2, dysfunction of the ear vessel, pain at the outer canthus. In the Lingshu, pain at the outer canthus. So they seem to be lifting from the Moxa text. In the heart meridian, we've got something similar again. If the disease again was the Yin and the Lingshu, if the meridian is diseased, there will be dry throat, thirst, and desire for liquids. Dry throat, thirst, and desire for liquids in Lingshu. Very good idea. And talks about diseases are due to qi reversal in the forearm. The language is concertingly. When you get to the pathways, it becomes more interesting still because they seem to borrow, which you can seems to borrow from both of these classics. The 11-foot arm vessel, at 8 sun above the inner malleolus, it crosses the foot tie-in vessel. At 8 sun above the inner malleolus, the Lingshu also says it crosses behind the foot tie-in meridian. That's very interesting because that's a sophisticated part of the pathway of the channel, the way they cross over on the leg, I think. And then on the yin yang classic, we've got, it originates at the hairy region on top of the big toe. It runs upwards along the top of the foot and ascends to the medial side of the leg. Again, in the liver, originates at the hairy region, the big toe, etc., etc. So they do seem to be borrowing direct from these texts. More discrepancies still, I'm afraid. But the two main Neijing texts actually mention, I hope I'm right in saying this, mention 27 earlier medical texts by name, all lost, none apparently Moxa related. And neither the Sua nor the Lingshu refer to the Moxa channel texts or even hints of their existence, despite their self-evident influence. So, what the hell's going on here? Well, I think a reasonable conclusion is to say that pre-acupuncture Moxa directly helped Han Dynasty physicians develop channel theory. The Moxa guys definitely didn't have it all. There's no, I don't want to pretend that for a second, but they were absolutely fundamental in developing more complex acupuncture theory. But for some reason, it didn't suit these new Han Dynasty scholar physicians to acknowledge this. Now, and the smoking gun for me is actually not the Sua or the Lingshu. They do both contain important positive references to Moxa, one of which we'll come to later. But it's the Nanjing that's an interesting one, because the Nanjing actually doesn't mention Moxa once. It's almost as if this is the final divorce from earlier Moxa theory. We're not even going to give it the time of day. And the Nanjing is an immensely important text to any of us as acupuncturists today. So I don't want to do any disservice by saying that. I just want to say that's the way it is. The consequences, I think, are important. So ever since Moxa has tended to play second string, in the century since, there's been some important exceptions. And as far as I'm concerned, these are the three. Emergency or last resort treatment, huge numbers of Moxa for yang collapse. I mean, enormous numbers of Moxa. For longevity, plainly wasn't in the case with Zhuangzi, because he was saying you don't do Moxa unless you're ill. Well, there's been traditions developed since where it's used for basic longevity and health, and for preventing disease than anything else, and also for intractable disease, which is what Jenny and I both know the most about with TB. So just briefly going through a couple of texts which I think are interesting in the ensuing centuries. Moxa Gao Huang Shu, which is entirely focused on Moxa, on bladder, now bladder 43, exclusively Moxa focused, including treatment of consumption. That is a typical sort of reversal of this bias towards acupuncture. And this one from Dukai, I'm not going to try and translate pronounce the title, because I don't know how to translate to pronounce QUE in Chinese, so I'm not even going to attempt it. It's the quote I love: "A doctor's use of moxibustionist to treat disease is like the use of fuel to cook a meal." Well, you can't cook a meal without fuel, so that tells you a little bit about Dukai's view on the importance of using Moxa. I wanted to just to include this paper. It's actually a reproduction or repainting of a very famous painting by a Song Dynasty artist, Li Tang. And somebody's having Moxa burnt, I would say almost certainly on Gao Huang Shu, on bladder 43. The reason why I'm including this part of it's a great painting is because what is happening here is very aggressive Moxa. There's the rather primitive looking Moxa therapist. He doesn't look like any sort of scholar physician to me. And this is the guy's friends. They're being held down. They're holding down his legs. They're holding his arms. The one behind him is squinting. Oh my God. And this poor guy is in serious pain. A lot of Moxa over the centuries was extremely aggressive. There's no debate about that. You really look for suppuration, you look for blisters, you're using big cones burnt right down to the skin traditions which have survived, but none of us are going to use them, I hope, anytime soon. Again, I want to plug somebody, Lorraine Wilcox, who's again another Chinese scholar, very practical person. She's lives, practices, and teaches in California. Specializes in Ming Dynasty texts, and has written a couple of books on Moxa. Ming Dynasty, as far as she's concerned, is probably the peak of Chinese medicine, and she focused on three key famous physicians, stroke authors: Li Shizhen, who was mainly herbalist but wrote quite a lot about Moxa; Yang Jinzhou, who wrote the Great Compendium, which was a real acupuncture classic; and Zhang Jiebin, all from around about the same time, all writing about Moxa. She's very interesting. Again, most of the treatments she describes are pretty aggressive, I've got to say. She lists some examples of Moxa texts which illustrate this imbalance between acupuncture and Moxa. So to give examples of each, with a text with acupuncture and no Moxa at all mentioned in it would be the Nanjing. So in other words, not really a Zhenzhou text at all, because it's only acupuncture. So the Nanjing. A text where Moxa is considerably less important than acupuncture would be the Suen and the Ling Shu, where Moxa and acupuncture are about equivalent. One of the texts from Sun Se Miao, one from Yang Zhezhu, and the Moxa is more important than acupuncture. We've got three authors she refers us to, and Moxa and no acupuncture. We've got Wang Dao and Du Kai. So that, you know, this dynamic between the two has shifted over the centuries. Now I want to get into a little bit of mythologizing of my own. So the big question is, okay, we know roughly when acupuncture originated. We know where it originated. The question is, if Moxa is much older, where did it originate and when did it originate? We're not going to know when, but we can speculate, I think, more on where. So the question starts off with, did Moxa actually originate in China like acupuncture did? Well, Suen 10 tells us all about the different types of Chinese medicine and the direction they came from. It says that Moxa came from the north. And if you look at a map of Han Dynasty China from about 100 BC, which is the time when we think acupuncture appeared, or the texts were written, we can see that the north basically is anywhere on the other side of the wall, the Great Wall. So what we can say when we say Moxa came from the north is it probably came from beyond the frontiers of the Chinese Empire. Now, it's not explicit in that, but I think there's very good reason to believe that might be the case. So when we say beyond the frontiers of the Chinese Empire, and that's me, not knowing the text I should have, that basically means in the lands dominated by nomads, including warrior horsemen. The Chinese write a lot about the warrior horsemen because they were an absolute pain in the neck for them. They kept attacking them, which is why they built the wall. But there was much more to these nomads than that, because they were also traders. So just a little bit about nomadic society in Central Asia. And you can see here, actually, this is the extent of the total extent of Asia. So here is China over on the east side. This will be the particular nomadic groups who will be interacting with the Chinese. Here we've got the west side. You've got like a what do we call it? A watershed in the middle. The Pamir Mountains are just north of the Himalayas. And interestingly, I'll just go on to the next slide. What we do know is that nomads were trading with Shang Dynasty, so that's going back to 1000 BC again, from around about 1000 BC through to whatever they want. The reason why we know that is because they were trading in jade. And what is known is where this jade came from. These jade examples have been found in tombs which they're able to trace where they came from. So going back to the previous slide, but the jade came from this area here, just on the east side of the Great Divide, for want of a better word, which is a long way in prehistoric times to the Shang civilization over here. Sorry, tell a lie, over here. Just as an aside, while they were trading with jade from here to the Chinese, at the same time, similar nomads were trading with lapis lazuli from eastern Afghanistan, which is, oh dear me, little button's gone, beg your pardon. Yeah, eastern Afghanistan, and they were trading with the Egyptians, because lapis lazuli has been found in Egyptian tombs, which comes from this area here. So there's huge long distance trading going on. It's not fanciful to say that there was significant contact between these people and the Chinese. But basically, well, I want to think like a nomad for a little bit. So what's the first thing you do when you pitch a camp, when you pitch a new camp if you're a nomad? Well, you light a fire. And what do you need if you light a fire? You need a spark and you need some tinder. And the fact of the matter is, a dried mugwort leaf is extremely good tinder, extremely good tinder. So basically, whether they were using mugwort or using fungus or using any other sort of tinder, what you would do is you would carry tinder with you. You would protect it literally with your life, because fire lighting basically is implicit with survival. If you can't light a fire, people in your family, your clan, your group are probably going to die, because they are likely to get cold and suffer. So what you do is you keep your tinder dry at all costs, and you keep it safe. So it's an incredibly valuable, you know, living in the centre eating things, we don't even get a sniff of this, but it's an incredibly valuable material. And so I just hypothesize here. So if we can imagine, we're coming down from summer pastures in the low Himalayas, for instance, or the heavenly Tian Shan mountains, and we're coming down from the high pastures with and we come down in two stages. We go to autumn camp, and then we go to a winter camp, and we get caught in a rainstorm, a bad rainstorm, which means that when we get to the autumn camp, we unfortunately find that our tinder is wet and we can't light a fire. We think about this, we think, oh, holy moly, we must never let that happen again. So what we do is we basically stash some somewhere where we know it's going to be dry. And then, this is my little hypothesis, 3 years later, same bloody thing happens again. We get caught in a rainstorm, and we think, now go and get that blooming, go and get the mugwort that we stored in the cave. So somebody runs off, goes and brings back the mugwort, and what we find is it's 3 years old. It burns more easily. So I just want kind of like just create a little myth of my own here, that I wonder whether that's where this tradition of the 3-year-old Moxa comes from. It burns more easily, and in terms of Moxa, if it burns more easily, it burns quicker, and if it burns quicker, actually its peak temperature is going to be a little bit lower as well. So there may be something here. I won't go further than that. But what I will say is that somewhere along the line, I'm pretty sure the game will get involved. So you've got smudging for spirit communication, you've got Moxa used for driving the demons of disease away, which is at the root of early Chinese medicine, pre-systematic Chinese medicine, which again, Paul and Shaw writes about quite a lot. It was demonic medicine, and Chinese medicine evolved from demonic medicine. So there's a coherence here. And basically, I'm come to the end of my little talk, and I want to leave a couple of things up on the screen. One is that quote that I've already used, which is a doctor's use of moxibustions to treat disease is like the use of fuel to cook a meal. And the other one is a quote from the Ling Shu itself, which is Moxa can be effective when needling is not effective. Which is a very interesting statement, bearing in mind it comes from what was called the Acupuncture Classic. And I want to leave that up so that we can think about it as we're going to answer questions. Hopefully, add one other little thing, which is I have a little bit of a hankering towards haiku. Basho, who's probably the Shakespeare in terms of haiku in Japan, wrote one haiku that I know of, which in which he mentions mugwort. Spring rain, the mugwort grows along a road with weeds, and it occurs to me that we can take Moxa, we can underestimate Moxa because we can take it for granted. It's too easy. The theories are too simple. The practice is too simple. That doesn't mean we should ignore it. That note, that's the end of my talk. So, Jenny, if I could hand over to you, and if you want to fire any questions, or if anybody's got any other questions, we'll see how it goes. But we'll go from there.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can. I hope everybody else can.
Okay. Hope so. Hope somebody else can. There's been a couple of questions. Helen Lucy Reed asked just now, actually, does Utzi's...
Great question. Yeah, I know what she's saying. What about Utzi?
Does it affect any of the timelines about when Acu started?
Right. Okay. Well, Utzi is an interesting character because I think he's about something like 4,500 BCE, something like that. Obviously, he's in the European area. There's been this speculation about Utzi and these tattoos on his body. I've got to say, I've never really studied them closely. But what I do know about Utzi, which is very interesting, is he was carrying with him a tinder fungus, and some pyrite, I think, that was in a pouch. Now, interesting thing is that the tinder fungus has been attributed that he was using it medicinally, I think, for parasitic worms or something. But actually, tinder fungus, there's a clue in the name. It's used as tinder. So he was carrying with him a fungus that was a tinder and something to spark it into light. Now, practically speaking, okay, it could well be just so that he could light a fire, because he's traveling through the Alps, he's going to get cold, which makes a lot of sense. But it could also be that he was using the fungus in the same way as we use Moxa. And the reason I say that is because, interestingly, there is, and it was Lorraine Wilcox who pointed me onto this one, actually, there is a traditional Scandinavian therapy, and I kind of, off the life of me, remember what it's called now, which is almost defunct, which involves burning tinder fungus in tiny pieces on the back as a therapy. So it's a very interesting that there appears to be a surviving tinder therapy using a different material in Scandinavian culture, in traditional Scandinavian culture, traditional Scandinavian culture is also shamanic in terms of its roots. So it begs big questions to me, but I don't think Utzi probably had much to do with meridians, which is what they kind of like. There's been some speculation about. I don't think so, but I could be wrong. So yeah, I don't think he interferes with the timeline. It's too early.
Okay, so, well, actually, the same person, Helen Lucy Reed, asked earlier on about, quite early in your talk, about an old radical suggesting that Moxa was very old.
Oh, yes, yeah.
She says that, you know, can that really be used to age stuff?
Well, I think it can, only in the way that it's pointed at as being very old in the 1st century of the Christian era, of the Common Era, so AD, in a dictionary which was looking at etymology, and it defined the character as being involved with the burning, with the heat application on these oracle bones. So it may not be associated directly with Moxa, more moxibustion as we understand it today, that's for sure. But it was involved with burning. And interestingly, that character Zhou, I can probably, well, let me just say, I'll just try and, that character Zhou was the character that was used in the Moxa text, those two Moxa classics that I described. They didn't use the full character, which is the character Zhou with the fire radical beneath it. They didn't use that, they just used the character Zhou. So somewhere between, for the sake of argument, the time of the oracle text is 800 BCE, and the time of the Moxa classics, for the sake of argument, 300 BC. So sometime in that period of time, this character or ideogram for pictogram, because it wouldn't have been the full character then, but the root pictogram for it was used for burning something into oracle bones, and then became something associated with Moxa. So it just indicates a periodicity or something that suggests that it's actually fairly ancient. I hope that answers our question. It's a good question.
Okay, there's more questions. Okay, somebody's asking, Audrey is asking about, what do you think about electric Moxa devices? And also someone's asking about using smokeless Moxa. So I don't know if you can address.
Right, okay. Well, it's a bit off topic for tonight, but if you're gonna ask it, I'll answer it. Electric and smokeless, yeah, okay. Well, these are my personal opinions, so they're not to be taken too seriously, but I think Jenny would agree, you'll agree with me on this. The thing about electric Moxa is you've got control of heat, which is great, but what you haven't got is the volatile oils that are contained in Moxa itself. Now, as I said, I declared my conflict of interest at the start. I'm very, very interested in small cone direct Moxa, in rice grain Moxa, and for many reasons. So I have this is an implicit bias in my answer. I know that there's been some research done using electric Moxa machines, and it's invoked. Jenny may talk about this in a month's time. It's invoked some changes in immune response, but it's not the same. If Moxa creates a broad immune response rather than a very specific immune response, which I think both we believe is probably the case, then it may be missing a trick in terms of what the volatiles can do. And Jenny's bound to talk about this, so I just want to basically point you into the talk, and that what we know is that some of the chemicals in Moxa can provoke changes in proteins beneath the skin, and that definitely has an effect on the immune system. So that's my garbled answer on the electric Moxa. Yes, it probably is helpful, but it may be missing a trick. The smokeless Moxa, yeah, I don't know is the honest answer. It's very useful if you've got nothing. If you can't use smoky Moxa, then it's very useful. And a lot of smoky Moxa is very smoky, but what the hell is in smokeless Moxa? And I don't know what it is. I think it's made from stalks, which are tightly bound, soaked, tightly bound together, and then burnt a bit like charcoal in very limited oxygen, I think. But what else is in it? Because it's a very acrid smell, and I'm not 100% sure how safe it is. I don't like it, to be honest, but it certainly creates heat. And maybe that's, again, we've got my conflict of interest, my bias needs to be considered in my answer. So, yeah.
Have we got time for more questions, Helen?
Yep, absolutely. We also have a couple of people that have kind of got their virtual hand up.
Oh, right.
So we've got Declan and Kevin. So Declan, I think you are first if you want to kind of unmute yourself and ask away.
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
I can see. Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Hello from Dublin and Ireland.
Oh, hi.
Hi, and thank you very much for your talk tonight. It's very, very interesting, and I'm enjoying it. I also I really enjoyed the book.
Thank you.
Now, I have two questions. I'm a 5-element acupuncturist as trained in CTA, and I use small direct cone moxa followed by needle tonification. What I do is I take, and as you said, it might be slightly off point in terms of the history. I'm just asking your opinion. What I do is I take fine moxa and I take coarse moxa and I mix them, and that seems to give me the best effect. So I'd be interested for your observations, your opinion on that, using a combination of fine and coarse, 50-50. And my second question is, do you have what do we know about when we buy moxa from all our suppliers? You know, where is it coming from? How old is it? We don't know very much about it. So what would you recommend in that respect in terms of the moxa that we're buying from our suppliers? So two questions.
Sounds good. Interesting. First question, this idea about mixing the moxa. I've never heard this before. So what I would suggest is, which I think is true, is the more refined moxa, it burns faster. It's purer. It's nearer to. If you look at the ash you get from more refined moxa, it's almost pure black. The less refined it starts to go more and more sort of silvery grey, which indicates to me that the more refined you're getting like a pure carbon residue. I don't know if that's true or not, but it seems to me possible, so I'll say it. So basically, the reason why pure moxa is used for what we might call direct moxa, so moxa on the skin, is because if you're using direct moxa to burn down, you want to keep the heat lower, as low as possible. If you are using what I would describe as Leamington style moxa, I would call that snatch moxa. So with snatch moxa, you're using a larger cone. It's like maybe a small pea size, something like that, and you light it, and then you're waiting for the patient to tell you. You told me, Declan, if this is true or not. You let the patient, let it burn down till the patient feels it, and then you snatch the moxa off. Yeah. So now with that one, you don't want it to burn too quick, because otherwise you're not going to get there in time. And you don't mind if it burns a bit hotter, because you're going to snatch it off. So actually, it makes sense. What you're doing makes a lot of sense. It wouldn't be such a good idea to use top grade moxa, I don't think. Thinking it this way, thinking it from this perspective, it wouldn't be a good idea, really, probably, to use the best moxa for using it for this Leamington style snatch technique, because it's going to burn faster, and then you're probably going to be closer to the skin as well when the patient feels it, and you're going to have less room for error, if you see what I mean, and possibly upset the patient in the process. So I would say, I would say what you're doing is quite a good idea, actually. I've never heard it done before, but I like it. I don't know how you mix them up, because it must be quite tricky. Do you want to come off mute and tell us?
It was J.R. Worsley who recommended to mix them.
Okay.
Because the fine burns too fast.
Yeah.
And the coarse, because it's got little twigs in it, doesn't burn consistently, and it also can be hard to form it into a cone.
Okay. So
that's what I find it very good. But I was very interesting with your expertise as to whether. Oh, sorry. What was your question?
Just how you actually mix.
Oh, how mix? Oh, yeah. So you take a little bit of each, fine and coarse, and you put it in a blender, and you blend, and you make sure that, I've heard some people putting it in a plastic bag and shaking it, but I find the blender to be much more effective. Just a little bit. And actually, I shake the blender to make sure everything mixes, because it's quite static. It's not like a liquid that you put in a blender. But once you shake it up, and it comes out really, really soft cotton wool. It's really lovely to work with.
So the second part of your question, I think, was about where we get our Moxa from and how confident we can be in the product we're buying.
Yes.
I tell you what I think is probably unlikely that pretty much, I'm probably going to upset somebody here, but I think it's unlikely that anybody is selling 3-year-old Moxa just because of the economics of doing it. What I do know about is the Moxa industry in Japan is family industries, and they're on their knees. They're on their knees because there's a lack of demand, because traditionally, stick-ons are used. You could buy stick-ons in big chemists in Japan, but the tradition of Moxa is regarded as being a little bit old-fashioned and kind of primitive. So and the industry is struggling, and they outsource a lot of their product to China these days. That's not for public consumption, but it's true. So it's very hard to know where your Moxa is coming from. But I think that there are certain suppliers who are definitely more reputable than others. The best Moxa for the sort of small cone Moxa that we're talking about is unquestionably, in my opinion, is Japanese. There's good Moxa also from South Korea, which is interesting. The strains in South Korea are actually Chinese, and the strains seem to have some sort of impact on the ultimate quality. And there is good Chinese Moxa, but the certainly is from our investigations, the best. But you only need the best for certain, as you're saying, you only need the best for certain functions. You don't want to, as you're also saying, you don't want really rough Moxa because it spits. It burns very irregularly and it spits, and that can get you in trouble, obviously. But I think it's a question of finding the Moxa, which I don't want to recommend any because I think it's not fair on others. Actually, you can grow your own and you can make pretty reasonable Moxa yourself. It's not that difficult to do, but it's therapeutic. It takes a little while to do it. But yeah, is that okay? Have I answered your question?
Thank you very much, Merlin. Really appreciate that.
No, you're very welcome. So, Kevin, I can see you on the top of my little screen here. So if you want to unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
I can indeed.
Welcome, and thank you very much indeed, Merlin. And this is welcome from Bonnie Dundee, although it's blowing a right hoolie out here at the moment. Just a couple of points. Excellent talk. I do love the idea of the history. Many years ago, over 30 years ago, when I was a student under Royston Lowe, he went on and on at great length, and as did my tutor, who was a Professor Yijun Zhao, over from China. They always used to quote that Moxa was the master, the needle was the pupil. So Moxa was always far more important than the needle in his eyes. So the combination of the two was greatly appreciated. And I still, up until, unfortunately, the years of COVID, the last 2 years, I used to use pure Moxa in or gold Moxas, I call it, in very small, I think the terminology is oki or oki? Oki. On specific points. Other than that, grade 1 Moxa to be burned directly on the needle. But unfortunately, of course, Moxa produces a lot of smoke. And incidentally, smokeless Moxa, as you so rightly say, it still smokes. And I would be very worried as to what the contaminants are in smokeless Moxa. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. You're better off just using grade 1 Moxa and saving the pure Moxa for the oki. But thank you very much indeed.
No, thank you. I'll just come back to that. The oku is a Japanese word, and it's interesting because I'm no expert in Japanese. I'm better in Japanese than I am with Chinese, but no expert. But Q is actually the word for Moxa. O is what they call an honorific. So green tea in China is o-cha,
Right.
ordinary tea is cha. So it's honorable tea is green tea, and Oku is honorable moxa, which gives you an idea of the traditional veneration. Would that be the right word? Something like that, which was awarded. Sorry?
How widely it's been used.
Possibly, yeah, which it was. I mean, there's a very, very interesting tradition of moxa use in Japan, which is probably more sophisticated than elsewhere. I just mentioned one other thing, actually, since it's just occurred to me, is because we mentioned longevity, and I spotted for the first time one of the people, I can't remember who it was, somebody I quoted who appeared to have lived, according to the dates, for 101 years. And I wanted to mention 3 moxa specialists who have all lived to over 100. One of which is Sun Tzu Miao, who lived to 101 in the 7th century, I think, which is pretty old for that time. Another which is a South Korean moxa master, in inverted commas. He got himself in a little bit of trouble here and there, I think, but a guy called Gudang, who developed a popular sort of tradition of moxa in South Korea, who died very recently at the venerable age, I think, of 105. And the other is a doctor who is our inspiration for Mox Africa, Dr. Shimataro Hara, who died in the late 1980s, I think, did research, the research that we picked up on with Mox Africa, with TB. He was treating TB with moxa in the 1930s in Japan, and he lived to the ripe old age of 108. And for the last, I think, 3 months of his life, was officially the oldest male in Japan. Because there's like a website which you can look up and you can find his name there. So they continuously register the oldest female and the oldest male in Japan on an ongoing list. And for the last 3 months of life, he was officially the oldest male in Japan, which is, I kind of think this must testify to some degree with this idea that moxa can provoke longevity. In which case, one of the take-homes from this talk, I hope, is that people consider moxing themselves on a regular basis to live a long and healthy life.
Stomach 36.
Yeah, there you go.
Classic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Merlin, just on that note, if we've still got time, and I don't know if there's any more questions, but a couple of people have asked about the 100-day Moxa challenge. And I see that Ben's given them our website link. Have you got a minute to tell people, just because there's still lots of people listening, I think?
Oh yeah, okay. I'm more than happy to be honest, have the opportunity to do it. To put it in the background, for, as I mentioned, I think for something like 14 years we've been beavering away trying to establish how moxa may or may not help people recover from tuberculosis, particularly interested in drug-resistant tuberculosis, which is a horrible disease, very, very widespread in certain quarters of the world, and has a case fatality rate of probably 50 to 70%. So quite a different animal to COVID, I have to say. And we've done three clinical studies. We've been involved in, it'd be more accurate to say, 3 randomized controlled trials. Cumulative or collectively, the information we've got there is actually really compelling. That what it appears to do, it seems to provoke a host immune response to what could be described as a lingering pathogen, because it's a very chronic disease. To push out the pathogen, whether it eradicates or not doesn't matter. It basically seems to put it back into a latent state, and improve recovery rates. We've got stuff on a website which describes that, and I don't want to go into detail, but COVID basically disabled all of our work in that. So last year we were scratching our heads thinking, we've got a pile of moxa and we've got more money actually in the moment, and we've got, not that it's that much, but we've got more money at the moment in the charity than we've actually probably ever had. So beg your pardon. So what the hell are we going to do with it? And the idea emerged, well, hang on a second, there's this thing called long COVID. and it's not being addressed in any efficient manner. Or this is earlier last year, even in this country or in so-called developed countries. What the hell must be happening with this in countries which have deficient health infrastructures? It's not even being looked at because they've got too many other things to look at in the meantime. So we thought, well, hang on a sec. What if we're right in our assumption, and we know we can't say it conclusively. We've got very good indicators that Moxa, just like other people have claimed in the past, that Moxa does provoke some form of broad immune response, which strengthens your immune response to one pathogen like tuberculosis. It's a mycobacteria, it's not a virus. But if you can do that, and it's a broad response, then could it do the same with long COVID? Bear in mind that long COVID seems to have be associated with some form of chronic viral infection that's creating some sort of long-term chronic inflammation in the body. So we thought, well, let's give it a go. So what we've developed is how formal is it? It's not completely formal, but basically we invite people from anywhere in the world who have got or consider themselves to have long COVID to get in touch with us. We'll supply them with Moxa, we'll supply them with detailed instructions and support, all done remotely, and ask them to Moxa the points that we ask them to Moxa for 100 days, with the idea that we measure their responses at the start, or we measure their health, their basic health parameters at the start of the 100 days and at the end, and we compare the two. We're testing 4 different protocols, and we're also developing a control group from challengers who basically drop out for one reason or another. We ask them if they don't mind if 100 days after we send them the Moxa, if they wouldn't mind filling the final questionnaire in anyway. So basically, at the end of the 100 days, we hope to have a picture of how Moxa, how these 4 protocols perform against each other, and also how they perform against no Moxa at all as our control for the ones who've dropped out. One other important question that is being asked behind this is kind of like implicit in the whole thing is, and how practical and how successful will we be in running what is basically a remote program of Moxa therapy? Because the idea behind it is, if we do develop, say for instance, our protocol number 3 turns out to be head and shoulders above any of the other protocols, then we could invite anybody from anywhere in the world, and we're particularly, with Moxa Africa, we're particularly focused on low-income countries. If they've got internet connection and any form of postal service that we might be able to send Moxa through, then basically, well, we'll give you a shot. We'll tell you what to do. We'll do all the support that we can, and we'll send it. We won't get on a plane to do this. We're going to send it through the post, so it's going to be minimal carbon footprint, and we'll send it until the Moxa runs out. We'll keep sending it, and that's the biggest question of all, because we're proving to ourselves one thing, which is that it is not easy doing a remote Moxa program, but it's incredibly exciting because of its potentials, because there must be millions of people with long COVID out there now. There must be. And if Omicron does provoke long COVID in the same rates that the other variants have done, then oh my God, because the infection rates have been so high. But there's no evidence of that. It may be Omicron doesn't provoke long COVID. We don't know yet. But it's certainly got some potential. The end of my little pitch here, which is what it is that our enrollment has been spectacularly slow, much slower than we ever imagined. Our target was for 200. We wanted to have basically 4 protocols, 50 on each, and then we've got some numbers that we can actually compare at the end. We thought we'd fill it in bearing in mind the numbers I was just talking about, how many long haulers there may be out there. We thought we'd fill it really quickly, and we haven't, because we can't touch into the general public. It's too weird. We're trying to address that, but here's the appeal. If you have any long haulers you know or you're treating who might be interested in this, please, please, please ask them to get in touch. All we'd ask is they can still have acupuncture. All we'd ask is just don't touch them with any Moxa if you don't mind for 100 days. You can give them any sort of support you want. We know they live in a real world. There's no way we'd ask anybody not to have any other therapy in the course of 100 days. We've just got to accept that's a limitation of our study. But we really need the numbers. And because the sooner we get the numbers in, the sooner we get the results. And it's no good getting the results in a year's time, because we're a practical charity. We're not academic, we're practical. We want the data so that we can use it, not the data so we can just publish it in some journal and move on. So yeah, I hope that Jenny, have you got anything you want to add to that?
Sorry, I've just replied to somebody, just to look at the website. It's great that we can have this opportunity to speak to acupuncturists to say, please, if you think your patients would do this, then great, get them involved, because we do need more people to get involved. And actually, from the ones that have been involved and have actually done it, that we've had really lovely, grateful feedback, haven't we? People are really pleased.
Some people have found it much harder than certainly than I imagined they would. That's definitely the case. But we're getting some good feedback. It's exciting, I think we're onto something. So let's hope anyway. Now it's 8:25. I can see Penny Boylan's got her hand up. Jenny, have you got any more questions?
No, I don't think so, actually.
Well, okay, let's say, Penny, if you don't mind, we can unmute you, and let's say you're the last question. Okay, then we'll wind up.
Okay, hello everybody.
Hi.
And Merlin, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Yeah, I just wanted to bring in chronic fatigue sufferers, because the profile of chronic fatigue is very, very similar to long COVID, and there are a lot of people out there with CFS, ME as it was originally referred to. So yeah, just wondering about that as a patient group that could also be very, very interesting to look at in a similar way to the way you're looking at the long haulers of COVID.
100%. I mean, I put it the other way around. I think long COVID profile is very similar to chronic fatigue, really, isn't it? Whether they're exactly the same thing, I suspect the long COVID is coming in different shapes and sizes. But I think anything that we learn from long COVID, we could reasonably apply to chronic fatigue. If I treat chronic fatigue patients, it won't be long before I introduce them to Moxa and then ask them to do some carefully instructed home Moxa to try and gently support their immune response. With both these conditions, which I'm sure you'll know doubtless better than me, you've got to be careful, because if you push too hard, you get a sort of flip back. Whatever sort of therapy they're doing, you've got to take it carefully and gently. I think you've got to be patient with it.
No, absolutely. I mean, my terminology for chronic fatigue is yang phobia. I mean, there's a lot of research now substantiating that chronic fatigue is actually trauma-based. It's a trauma complex locked deep inside the nervous system. It's basically a fatigue in the mitochondria. Your energy batteries just aren't working properly, and they're in a freeze state, which is now known as another defense response out of fright, flight, fight. And then we have freeze and fawn. So yeah, you've got to do it step by step, because the system is in lockdown, and if you open it up too fast, it basically has a massive backlash reaction and recruits the freeze response again and shuts the system down into fatigue again. So it's got to be titrated. But yeah, I find it all very fascinating, and how we really need to start sort of educating people about what I refer to as yang phobia, that their nervous system just can't cope with internal mobilization at all, and it just is totally overcoupled to this freeze response at a very, very deep level, and at a cellular organelle level.
Yeah, I think that one of the things we've not been very good at as a profession is coordinating our our understandings, our learnings and things, and create a more what's the word? Well, I guess coordinated is a more coordinated sort of strategy to not just, this is not just about promoting our own therapy, it's about helping people get better. And anything that is basically, how to put this as politely as possible, that doesn't feed the profits of the pharmaceutical industry and its shareholders is very, very difficult to promote, and very, very difficult to research, as Jenny and I know far too well. We've got a moral responsibility here, I think, whether it's chronic fatigue, whether it's long COVID, whether it's cancer support, whether it's tuberculosis, it doesn't matter. I think we've got a moral responsibility to really try and get our heads together on this. And what I hope is, by blarting on like this all the time, that young people are going to pick this up. Young people in our profession are going to pick it up, and they're going to get passionate about it, and they're going to shake the tree, because the tree does need shaking. I think our sort of edifice is a little bit, I don't know, we've missed something important, I think. So yeah, that's probably all I need to say on the matter. But I've gone on too long. It is now almost exactly 8:30, which is when we said we're going to finish. So I guess what I'm going to say is I've just had this little bit of thing in this corner of my screen. I have no idea how many people have been here, but I think that Helen said at the start we may have had 50 people at one point. So that's a hell of a number for me. I've never done a webinar like this before, so it's been a great privilege to me to do so, and I'm very, very grateful to everybody who's given us the time and attention tonight. On that note, I guess I don't know exactly how you formally wind something like this up, but it's somewhere along the line I'm gonna end something or something like that. But maybe I can invite Helen to come back in to wind it up. But thanks ever so much to everybody who's attended and contributed in any which way at all. And please don't forget about the 100-day Moxa challenge. If you've got any patients or friends or family or anybody with long COVID, we'd love to hear from them.
Thank you, Merlin. That was fantastic, and a load of very, very appreciative people and comments in the chat. We actually did get up to 78 at one point.
God.
So yeah, it's been a very, very popular talk. So thank you very much, and thank you everybody for attending. I'm going to stop the recording now and just thank you very much.